The following program is brought to you by Whiteman TV and Bruce Telecom.
All right. Oh yay! Oh yay! Oh yay! Greetings, time travelers! As the official town crier of Erin, it is my duty to welcome you to a tour of All Roads Lead to Erin, an exhibit by the Wellington County Museum and Archives in partnership with the Town of Erin Heritage Committee, designed to transport you back along a route that meanders 200 years into our past. Throughout most of history, the location of communities has been determined by what the land offered at different places. Then, as society became more mobile, the paths between our communities took on their own importance, and the placement of new settlements was determined by daily traveling distances. In other words, our country was populated in stages, based on how far a stagecoach could go. Even today, our populations of commuters are driven by driving times. Discover in this exhibit the birthing of our local economies back in the days when the marketplace was created by human needs rather than the other way around. Regale the heady days of our tax-free past, when the law made the residents build all of the roads by hand at the direction of the government, which then charged cash for their use. Imagine the 124 ETR or the Trafalgar toll. Know ye that no matter where you lived, all of the schools were within walking distance, because that's how you got there. Of course, the distance abilities of our great-great-grandparents may well have exceeded those of our children today. How is this relevant? Why look at the way things used to be? As town crier, I'll let you in on the most important secret. Our choices today have profound effects on the future of our children and grandchildren. The wisdom to make wise choices can only come from a profound understanding of change, seeing how past decisions have shaped our present, and grasping that things will not always be as they are at any moment of time. The people who originally traveled these lands for thousands of years called this seven-generation thinking. Come, travel our past in a context where all roads lead to Erin, and see where we have come from and how, so that you might understand where we're going. Proclaimed in this bicentennial year of the Adjutant's Purchase, also known as Treaty 19, when we became stewards of this land, 2018, God save the Queen.
Welcome to the Wellington County Museum and Archives and a tour of our latest exhibit, All Roads Lead to Erin. This exhibit is a joint project between the museum and the Town of Erin Heritage Committee. And so here today we have Jean Dennison from the Town of Erin Heritage Committee representing Erin.
Thank you very much, Hailey. It's been a delight to work on this project. The Heritage Committee was approached by Wellington County Museum to see if we would have some artifacts that we would like to feature here. And so we rallied, put a couple of people together to join Hailey and plan this exhibit. And it's exceeded what we thought we were going to get. It's a beautiful exhibit. I wish you'd come and see it. And the title is All Roads Lead to Erin. And right there in our front picture, come this way, Hailey, a little bit. That's the Erin Stagecoach in Ospringe. Around when, Hailey?
1909. 1909.
It's en route from Guelph to Erin. And this was a major transportation alleyway for mail delivery, for livestock shipment to market in Guelph, as well as salespeople and all kinds of things. Relied on the Erin stage to make that connection to Guelph. We also had a stage line that ran from Georgetown up through to Hillsburg as well. So anyway, let's walk through the exhibit and see what we've got.
Sounds good. So all throughout the exhibit, you're going to see stories that are based in different subjects that all have to do with transportation and really how it affected the growth of Erin over the years. So here where we're standing right now, we're talking about the spread of the railway and how it influenced commerce and railway tourism throughout all of Erin's communities that were affected by the railroad. And also we talk about schools, which is a particularly interesting subject, in my opinion, because people don't really realize how connected the placement of schools throughout the township was affected by transportation. There were actually small one-room schoolhouses spread all throughout the township because all the students had to walk to school. So the idea was, if you built many schools and you clustered them where there were farms, it limited how far each student had to walk. And these schools basically started to close in the 1960s once we had school buses. And that's when they started building the larger, more centralized schools that people in Erin Township now recall attending.
So along that line, in particular on this wall, there were two favorite stories that I did some interviewing for this exhibit. And one of them is the picture of the truck with all the kids piled around the truck. That was the young, very young man who was the principal and only teacher at the one-room school in SS number 11, I think it was, which was called the Ninth Line School in Erin Township. And he explained to me that when it was a lovely sunny day in June and they wanted to play baseball with the neighboring school, which might be 4 or 5 kilometers away, he would arrange with the other teacher and say, let's play a game this afternoon. And he said, I would load all 28 students in the back of my farm truck and just take them over to the other school. And then he said to me, do you think I could be sued today if people knew that that's how we got together for baseball games in the early 1900s? The next picture right next door shows a transition of school bus to motorized vehicles. So before there were actual school buses, rather, when the children they started consolidating the schools around 1962 in Erin Township. The children no longer had to walk. They were bused, or at least taken by transportation to local consolidated schools. And this was a time for any entrepreneur who had a car at his disposal. He could slap a school bus sign on the top and just go around the back roads and pick the kids up on the way to school. So that was the launch of the school bus industry. And interestingly enough, this picture is Clarence Denny's car that he outfitted as a school bus, and that led to Denny's Bus Lines, which is now very, very familiar in Erin and Eramosa Township. Then moving along, we've got a lovely map that shows all of the individual school areas that Hailey mentioned. So one-room schools, walking distance for children. But if children visit this exhibit, I hope they appreciate how far some of those kids had to walk to get to their school. So you're looking many concessions in all kinds of weather for them to attend the school. And then, of course, in this exhibit, there's just some other things to do with the school, including the strap. Long gone, no more straps, but it was a very real thing in the early days of education.
Absolutely, a big fear. You're going to get the strap if you don't behave.
That's right.
Teacher will smack your fingers. So, Now I'm here with Tony Verhagen, who's an Erin resident and actually responsible for voicing a number of stories from some pioneer stories that are included in the exhibit as some audio clips that you can listen to. So thank you for doing that, Tony.
Not a problem. I enjoyed it. But I found it very interesting, too. We in our society, we're so attuned to the fact that we pay our taxes and the roads are looked after and the infrastructure is looked after, but that wasn't the case when the people back in the early 1800s had to set up their roads and set up all their transportation needs. And I found it very interesting that landowners had an obligation to the municipality or whatever form of government was in their area to actually give days of labor to put together roads and to maintain roads, or in some cases to snow or to plow snow or dig snow in many cases, so that they could actually build and maintain the roads. And this just seemed to be the common way of the time. And we have some illustrations here of some of the results of that. You can see in the first picture, by particularly, the state of the roads, lots of mud, stomped down by horses. So it was a significant challenge. And of course over here we have, I find this very interesting, they had toll houses because for a long time after the roads were put in, they had to be maintained. Not only did it mean that people still had to put time in on the roads, but they had to buy the products. A lot of the roads were corduroy wood. So if you're going to maintain the road after a while, you actually have to have the wood cut, purchased, wagoned to where it's going to go. So not only do you put in time, you put in extra money too through tolls to help maintain the roads. So I found this really interesting and kind of glad the system changed a little.
It is interesting so Wellington County actually abolished tolls countywide in 1872, but County Road 124, for example, from Erin to Guelph, that we're all very familiar with now, it was actually a toll road once upon a time, and it was actually cut through in 1844. So from 1844 to 1872, if you wanted to travel on that road, you had to pay for it. There were a few exceptions. Travelers who were going through the toll and back the same day didn't have to pay twice. If you were going to church, if you were going to a funeral, or if you were a pastor on clerical duty, you didn't have to pay either. But generally speaking, based on how many head of livestock you were driving through the toll gate or how many horses were pulling your rig, what you had to pay varied between 2 and 6 pence. But yeah, you had to pay to use the road. So that's something nowadays we just think of Highway 407 as the only toll road that most of us have ever been on. But it used to be all throughout, the neighborhood that we take for granted now. Now, Tony, there's one particular photo that's captured your attention in this exhibit. Could you tell us a bit about that, please?
Well, I don't know a great deal about the history. This is the Globe Hotel in Erin. I believe it burned down in 1945. But this particular building, this church, it still exists. It's still in Erin. And because of this and where this picture is taken and the location and everything else, we know exactly where this was situated at the time. This particular area right now is an automobile repair facility. But it just struck me because, as with a lot of the photographs on here, and myself being a bit of an amateur photographer, it just struck me how some of these are not spectacular events. They're just simple things in the community, and yet, at this point, they're actually kind of treasures to our past. And I got thinking, especially for any other amateur photographers, some of the stuff you may consider that you're taking in your town or your community may not be all that spectacular or great, but another 80 years or 100 years down the road, these may be treasures other people are looking at that you unwittingly did, and it's such a worthwhile enterprise. Again, the hotel in Hillsburg, that is still in existence. But the archway for the stables, although it's still there, it's not as prominent today exactly what that was for. Unless you know the history, you don't exactly know why has they got this big hole in the building. Well, it was so they could drive their horses and wagons to the livery area in behind. But just little things like that can make such a difference, I think, for future generations in assessing and realizing our history. And this is just, it would be a continuation of this. I just love the visual aspect of this. I really do.
That's a great point, Tony. Thank you. So we've been talking a little bit about transportation and what that's meant for buildings and roads and schools. But it's also interesting to think about how people were getting around, what the vehicles were, and what that meant for their daily lives. Jean, I think you have some insight into this.
Well, I want to comment on the whole exhibit, and as Tony had said, makes you stop and take a look at how different our lives are today. So I jump in the car, I live out in the country in Erin Township, I jump in the car and drive into town for a bottle of milk and don't even think anything of it. Back in the 1800s and early 1900s, they relied on horsepower. And God bless the horse. You know, really, what would our pioneer people have done without them? So in the summer and in the fall, as you can see in this picture, there's a beautiful carriage ride down a lovely country road. And that was enjoyed by many all the time, to go to the local community centers or to church on Sunday or to picnics in Stanley Park in Erin. However, in the winter, that carriage is useless. So they put the carriage away in the barn and out comes the sleigh. And it was very common to have lots of people out on the roadways in the countryside on sleighs. What I love about this exhibit is Hailey has peppered the exhibit with excerpts from our local diaries, from people in the late 1800s and early 1900s who were actually writing about what it was like to go by sleigh into town to visit the doctor or to do some shopping. And she's done a beautiful job of making this all flow together and take us through what it was like to live in that time and have to rely on the horse. Now, the other thing I want everyone to think of is in the spring, probably the spring more so than any other season, that's when the roads mired down. As Tony said, they were corduroy roads. They weren't paved. They weren't even graveled. They were just corduroy roads. So the roads mired down in mud. You couldn't use your wagon, and you couldn't use your cutter, so you walked. And if you weren't walking, many times in the diary excerpts that I've read, people would say, I took the train to Erin to visit the doctor. So the train was a viable mode of transportation for them. They walked to a train station and could get to the next village when the roads were too sloppy to be used. And speaking of sloppy, this little collection of pictures would particularly give women an appreciation of what it would be like with a long skirt to maneuver your way around through a muddy, mucky village that only has boardwalks to lift your skirts up off the muck and the mire. But these are a collection of 3 lovely pictures, Hillsburg and 2 in Erin, of the businesses there and what it was like to live at that time.
So one of the stories that I find particularly interesting that we touch on in this exhibit is the stagecoach, the age of the stagecoach. The stagecoach was really much more than just a way to travel. Stagecoaches brought mail, most importantly, to a lot of communities throughout Erin. On County Road 124 between Erin and Guelph, the Guelph-Erin stage ran along that route, and communities like Ospringe, the stage stopped there. They brought mail, they brought passengers, which meant they brought people who would buy things. So stores sprung up there. There were hotels in Ospringe. And if you're familiar with that Four Corners intersection today, there's not as much going on commercially. There's certainly no large hotels, but during the time that the stagecoach ran through, it was a very different place. And the stagecoach, it's worth mentioning that it would cost you 75 cents to go from Erin to Guelph in 1871 on the stagecoach, and it would take just over 4 hours if the weather was good, and then it would come back the same day. So you could get to Guelph and back in a day, but it would be a really, really long day. So thinking about that is interesting, because now that trip is so quick, you could do it 10 times a day, and it would really be meaningless. So we like to think about the differences between the stagecoach and now, and there was actually an interesting transition period where they went from the horse-drawn stage to a motorized stagecoach. Right around, actually 1913 was the first year that the Guelph-Erin stage was actually a motorized coach. But of course, in the winter, they didn't have snowplows on these roads yet, so they would actually bring out a sled sometimes instead of the wheeled carriage, and instead of the motorized stagecoach, they still needed a horse-drawn sleigh. Because even though we had a sophisticated route of transportation, the quality of the roads themselves were still a bit iffy. So it's very interesting. So one of the first things that you'll see when you come to see this exhibit is the actual very original survey chain that was used to survey the township in 1819. The survey of the township was actually done in 2 halves, which is why there's a bit of a jog in the roads. Because they started from one end, and then the next year they started from the other end, but that's neither here nor there. This was the original chain used to lay out all the lots and concessions. And this exhibit is actually occurring in the 200th anniversary of this survey. The land that the town of Erin lies on was actually purchased from the Mississauga First Nation in 1818, and the survey began in 1819. So October 2018 marks the 200th anniversary of the purchase of this land. So we felt it was very important to acknowledge that, we here at the museum and the residents of the town of Erin, we have now become the stewards of this land that was once the ancestral territory of the Mississauga First Nation, the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe peoples. There's been a long history of inhabitants in this region going back to the end of the last ice age over 10,000 years ago. So we're talking about transportation and the more recent history of the town of Erin, but we acknowledge that the history in this region is very rich and goes back a long, long way, and we like to celebrate that.
I just wanted to draw folks' attention to how important the rails were to our early pioneers. Earlier I had mentioned that they may have used the train simply to go from Hillsburg to Erin to visit the doctor, but sometimes they branched further afield by train. I interviewed a lovely woman whose dad owned Stanley Park at one point. Her name was Margaret Duggan, and her dad was Harry Austin. And she told me when she was a young person, a very young person, her mother and other neighboring mothers allowed their children to go down to Erin train station and catch the morning train as it came down from Fergus through Orton, Hillsburg, Erin, and on to Cataract. At Cataract, there's a mill pond. So the kids would get on the train with a few coppers in their hand to give to the conductor, and they'd get dropped off in Cataract, where they'd swim all day. No lifeguards, no supervision, and they'd catch the afternoon train as it came back up from Toronto, through Cataract, into Erin, and on through Hillsburg and further north to Fergus. And that was the branch of the Credit Valley Railway that opened up transportation. So for our area, particularly in the town of Erin, so a lot of folks then discovered Stanley Park, beautiful Stanley Park in downtown Erin. So they would come up from Toronto for family picnics, horse races, bicycle races, very popular at the turn of the century, and all easily accessed by a daily train that moved back and forth between Fergus and downtown Toronto. So these are lovely photos that Hailey's included in the exhibit from the Hillsburg train station, the Orton train station, and excerpts again of people's diaries where they refer to how important the train service was for them to get from place to place.
So one of the interesting stories that we talk about as well when it comes to the railway is how the village of Orton, or the hamlet of Orton, received its name. It was actually a settlement going back a long way that didn't really have an official name until the railway came. Because when the railway came, it meant that the mail came to Orton, which was fantastic for all the locals who lived there, who previously had to travel quite a distance to get their mail. Now they were going to be able to get it right in town, something we take for granted today. But there was no name of the settlement, so when the post office was opening, the policy at the time, if they were opening a new post office somewhere where there was no name, they chose a name based on a member of parliament whose riding was close by. So Orton was named for Dr. Orton of Fergus, a sitting member of parliament at the time. And a lot of people don't know that, and it's not the only post office in the area that was named that way, but it is the only one in the town of Erin that has that sort of unique history to it. In a couple places throughout the exhibit, we have some audio stations. So if you want to come to the exhibit and you pick up the phone, you can listen to an audio clip that's someone reading out a story, basically a diary excerpt or part of an interview with someone who used to live in the town of Erin, about 100 years ago. It's sharing their memories as regards to transportation. So some of them have to do with the roads, the state of the roads, either building the roads or trying to travel along the roads and how difficult that was. One of the clips is actually talking about having to work on the roads. Nowadays, we pay taxes, and that helps to pay for the construction and the maintenance of our roads. But if you were living in Erin Township in 1910 and you owned a farm, you had to work 3 or 4 days a year on the roads. You couldn't pay someone to do it for you. You had to take time out of your own busy schedule as a farmer to put in some work on the roads. And this could be laying a corduroy road, which is actually a log road. If you were cutting down trees, you would use the timber, lay it across the roadway, and you had a bumpy but pretty solid road called a corduroy road. Or maybe you were doing road work later on. You might have been graveling over the road or grading it and widening the road. Anything that now we think about as someone's job was actually something you had to do as someone who lived in the township. When we think about transportation, a story that we don't really think about is how people did their shopping and how people sold things to people in rural areas. The coming of the railway and the sort of the growth of the personal vehicle really changed how salesmen applied their trade. We have 2 examples here of some of the ways that traveling salesmen did their work. In the case here, we have a railway salesman's traveling sample box. It's really neat. It collapses down to this small, easy-to-carry case, and it contains samples. And the idea was the salesman would travel by rail from town to town, open up his case and display all the things that he was selling, and people would place orders, and then later on they would receive what they'd order at the train station. So really it was bringing stores to the local people who only had to go as far as the closest hotel or the closest store where someone might have set up a display. Just behind the case, we have a really interesting blanket, actually, that is from about 1920 from one of the mills in Aramosa Township, and it's made up of 16 different patterns, the idea being the salesman only had to carry one blanket to be able to sell 16 different patterns of blanket instead of having to, carry a whole case of blankets. It made his life much easier because he was getting on and off the train and in and out of cars and wagons going all over the place, so it made his life much, much easier. So I want to say a special thank you to Jean Dennison of the Town of Erin Heritage Committee and Tony Verhagen and Andrew Welch, our town crier, for joining us today to give this tour of All Roads Lead to Erin. And I'd like to invite you all to come out and see it. The Wellington County Museum and Archives is open 9:30 to 4:30 Monday to Friday, and from 1 to 5 on the weekends. Admission is by donation, and All Roads Lead to Erin will be on display until the end of March 31st, 2019. So please come out and explore the exhibit and learn about all the other stories that we didn't get to in today's tour.
The preceding program was brought to you by Whiteman TV and Bruce Telecom.